This episode may contain sensitive language not suitable for children. Hello, and welcome back to Season 2 of Through Black Eyes Unfiltered, the podcast that brings truth to light. Listen to present-day historical events that shaped our history and will determine our future, as presented by moderator Raymond Dunn and expert Marvin Dunn. I'm Dr. Raymond Dunn, and I'm the author of 2 children's storybooks. My first storybook is The Little Scrub Christmas Tree. It's the story of a little tree that finds itself growing up in a Christmas tree forest. In this story, I have embedded many lessons that young children might learn that will help them as they mature. My second book is The Robin That Could Not Sing. And this is the story of a little bird that tried very hard to be like all of the other birds. And there are also lots of lessons involved in this book that young children might pick up as they read the story that would help them in their everyday lives and other obstacles that might come their way. I'm Dr. Raymond Dunn.
I'm Dr. Marvin Dunn.
And in this episode, we will discuss the history of lynching in the state of Florida. Marvin, I understand that Florida has a violent history. A very violent history.
It does. It does.
I read your books, and I know that you've dealt with that, and I'd like to share some of that with our audience, if you don't mind.
Sure. And you know what? I think what we'll be talking about today, lynching in particular, is covered in 2 of my books. A History of Florida Through Black Eyes includes all of the topics that we're going to be talking about today.
Mm-hmm. And I was so impressed as I read your book, and I looked at the list of all of the places where lynching took place in Florida. And for each place, you identified the person by name. I mean, and the list goes on and on and on.
Well, Ray, the list that we have of lynchings in the South, including in Florida, is an incomplete list because there were many lynchings that were never reported.
Wow.
People were afraid to report someone had been lynched. So we can only estimate about 3,000 to 4,000 people were lynched in Florida during this period. The period I'm talking about is from the beginning of Reconstruction up to the 1950s.
I'm always talking about our young audience. I've got grandchildren, and they don't know. So for the sake of those youngsters, Marvin defined, if not describe what a lynching is.
Well, let's start with defining a lynching.
Okay.
There was a meeting of some liberal groups. I think they met at Tuskegee in the 1930s. The NAACP was represented. There were some white organizations that were represented, including white women who were opposed to lynching. So Quakers were involved. And these folks met to have an agreement on what it meant to be lynched, what exactly constituted a lynching, and how was a lynching different from a common murder.
Okay.
So they came up with some criteria for a killing to be classified as a lynching. First, there had to be a dead body. Now, there was debate about that because some folks said, well, suppose the person just maimed, his hand is cut off, or he's injured in some way that's permanent. Is that a lynching? Well, no, it's not. There has to be a dead body. Second, the killing must be extra-legal. It must have taken place outside of the law. Mm-hmm. Third, the act must have been done by 2 or more persons. And then finally, the motive for the attack must be race or revenge. So that is what makes a murder different from, a lynching different from a common murder.
So if a single person strung somebody up on a tree with a rope and killed them, that would not be...
That's a murder. That's a murder.
Okay, that's a murder. He murdered that person.
Right. You got to have more than one person involved for it to be a murder. And then it depends on why he did it. The motive of the killing is critically important in defining a lynching.
My first question is, how did the state of Florida compare with other states in terms of the number of lynchings?
Not good. Now, listen, what we know about these comparisons between levels of lynching in different states, we have a beginning point, that is that we've got to look at the total number of blacks in a state. So we look at the proportion of blacks in a state. For example, in terms of sheer numbers, there were far more black people in Mississippi than in Florida.
Okay.
But in terms of the proportion of black people in the population,
right,
Florida led all of the southern states. in terms of lynching. Alabama, Mississippi, we were well ahead. Another way of putting it is that you had a greater chance if you're a black person of being lynched in Florida than you did in Mississippi.
Wow.
There were reasons for that, why Florida was so much worse than the others. One reason was that Florida was a relative wilderness. So you didn't have as much lynching in settled places where there was law enforcement. But Florida really didn't become an inhabited place until well after the Civil War, certainly into the 1780s and 1790s. But before that, this was a wilderness down here. Okay. There was no law enforcement. If someone did commit a crime, white or black, it could take a month or more for the federal judge to come around and decide the case. So in rural areas like Florida was during this period, there was a higher tendency of people to take the law into their own hands rather than waiting for the federal system to come around to exacting some sort of punishment.
Right. So who wanted to wait that long when the emotions were high and they had captured the person that they thought was the culprit? They wanted to do it then, not wait for some district judge or whatever circuit judge to come back.
Then there were also concerns about the person getting away with it. That if we wait until the law take over and deals with the case, the person might get off.
And since that judge was federal, it could have been a situation where they would think, oh, he doesn't understand us.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. There was a lot of concern about whether or not black people who committed crimes against whites in the South, even after Reconstruction, whether they would actually be punished by the courts. That's a couple of the reasons why Florida had more lynchings than these other places. And I'll add a third one, which is a little bit controversial.
All right.
Florida, Georgia included as well. Florida was settled by Scotch-Irish people. Now, these were folks who were latecomers to the United States in terms of white immigration. They came in after the colonies had been established and the best land in the South had been taken up by Englishmen. Right. In come now these Scots. They were dirt poor, and the Scotch-Irish had a particularly virulent sense of racism in that society. And these were the people who settled the South, the deep South. So they brought with them ingrained racist feelings that were not as prominent in the North and in other white ethnic groups. So you had a white culture settling in Florida that believed blacks were inferior, that blacks had to be contained, that they were dangerous, particularly to white women. So that's where your rednecks come from. These are the folks who met the criteria being, they were poor whites who came in after the whites who had some money came in and sort of started building farms and what have you. But you have this lower level of white people coming in as well. We now call them white trash. Mm-hmm. They were not property white people. They were there in support roles for whatever the economy might have been at the time. And some of them were dirt farmers too. But my point is, they were not typical of the white ethnic groups that were settling in the country during this period. These folks brought some very powerful anti-black feelings with them to this country.
I've never heard that part of our history before. That's why we need to hear this through black eyes. So tell us just a little bit then about a lynching or two that may have occurred in the North.
Well, I'm not as familiar with those, but I do know that there were lynchings of blacks and whites in the North. I can't cite any of them at the particular moment, Ray, but it's comfortable to conclude that there were lynchings in the North and the West, but that they were normally not racially motivated. Some other reason might have been the reason that these things took place.
So then go back then to what led to most of the lynching.
Why were most black people lynched? Mm-hmm. Well, the common view is that most blacks were lynched for raping or in some way sexually assaulting or insulting a white woman. That's not the main reason that most lynchings of black men took place. The main reason that lynchings took place was when a black person killed a white law enforcement officer. You killed a sheriff or a deputy or a constable in Florida, you would be lynched. There was a sense that if that nigga is so bad, he gonna shoot the police. We don't have time to wait for a judge to come around to figure out what to do with him. Hang him. So that kind of an attack aroused the white community to such an extent that it was almost expected that the end result would be the person would be lynched.
Look at the range of things that a black person could do and get lynched. In one of your books, I read about a young boy who wrote a love letter to a white girl, and as a result, he was lynched. So you're going all the way from killing a law enforcement officer to writing a love letter.
Well, people got lynched for less reason than that.
Like what?
Peeping into a white girl's bedroom.
Oh, my goodness. I've never heard of that.
Oh, yeah. A number of young black men over the course of the history of Florida, anyway, and probably similarly in other southern states, if you were found nosing around white women, there was a good chance they would kill you because you were seen as a predator. So being caught in a white girl's room in Florida, several black men and boys got arrested for that. Now, the question is, what was he doing in the white girl's room with her daddy right next door in the next room? He was there because she let him in. But then it's found out that she has a black man coming into the house. Now it's an assault. It's an attack. So there were so many instances in which the white female victims or alleged victims of rape were in fact involved in a consensual sexual relationship with the black man who was killed. But once the affair was found out, a very typical response of white women during that period was to claim that they were attacked. They were not involved in this consensually, because that was a problem. If you're a white woman in the South and it became known that you were raped by a black man, nobody would marry you.
You were scorned.
Yeah, you were a woman who didn't have as much value on the marriage market as a woman who had not been. So there were denials that these things happened, or there were cover-ups that these things happened.
Right.
But my point is, there was much more consensual sexual contact between the races, even during slavery, than is commonly known, and that once these things did become known, often the female insisted that she was attacked, and very commonly the black man disappeared. Often brothers, a lot of them got away by just running as soon as it got out that they were suspected, or were killed.
This just makes me remember a story that our father told us. As you well know, our dad came down to Miami-Dade County in the late 40s, I believe it was, to work. Dad said that he and other black men, of course, worked on many of the hotels that they were building over on Miami Beach. Dad said when they were up working on the upper floors, if a black man's hat blew off of his head and blew across Collins Avenue on the beach side, that black man could not go and get that hat because there were white women laying on that beach. If you wanted your hat, a white man had to go across the street and get it.
Yep.
How ridiculous.
Well, it was all ridiculous, but it was also very dangerous, because if you violated any of these social mores, you could be lynched.
Well, let's go back to some more technical stuff.
Okay, but let me just, in terms of the reasons for lynching, mention one other thing that got a lot of black men killed. You couldn't dispute the word of a white man or a white woman. The boss man said, you made $50 this week, and that's it. You couldn't say, but boss, I think I made $70. Oh, really, nigga? I guess I lied then. So once you challenge the veracity of what a white person said, particularly a white person who was in authority above you, you were tagged as a difficult black person, and you were watched, and there was a good chance that if you were really seen as being consistently inclined to challenge white authority, they would get rid of you.
That was one of the points that I've tried to make to young black men as we discussed that particular period in time, and they would come up with this: I wouldn't take that. I would have done this. I would have done that. I always say to them, and who would you have gone to? Yeah. Who would you have? What lawyer would you have gone to represent you? There were none. What sheriff are you? The sheriff is a white man, and he may even be KKK. There's nobody for you to go to. So stop all of this. I would not have. You would have. You would have fit right in with everybody else. Let me ask you a technical question so that we can move on. Every time I think of lynching, I think of someone hanging by the neck, from the neck by a rope. Is a rope necessary for lynching? Is that the only way you can lynch somebody?
No. A rope has nothing to do with lynching. You know, one of the problems that lynchers had was that very few of them knew how to tie a hangman's knot. You can't just put a rope around somebody's neck and just hang them. They could hang for hours or days by the time they're dead. You needed a technique that broke the neck instantly. But that required a hangman's knot, and very few of these guys really knew how to do that. So most people who were lynched were not hung, they were shot. But others were burned at the stake. Many were drowned. Many were beaten. But the largest number were shot to death. Lynching by rope was not as common as people tend to think. Now, there was a technique that these guys who didn't know how to tie a hangman's knot would use very effectively. They would take the victim out into the woods and they would identify a sapling tree. That's a young tree, maybe 12, 15 feet high.
That would bend.
Have a guy go up to the top of climb up to the top of the sapling tree and tie a rope to the top of the tree, drop it down. The other men would then pull the tree top, bend it to the ground, not to the ground, but bend it down, and they would tie a rope around the neck of a lynching victim. Now, you got men holding the tree to keep it from swinging back up while they tie this rope around the victim's neck. And then it's 1, 2, 3, let go. And the person would be thrown into the top of the tree. His neck would be broken like a kitten. And that was a very efficient way to kill people without knowing how to actually tie a hangman's knot.
Now, we hear about all of these lynchings. For the most part, I think there is a perception that when a lynching took place, that it was a group of men and they took somebody off someplace out in the woods and found a tree. And what many lynchings actually in public and people stood by and watched and brought the children to see it and all of that. It wasn't necessarily something that was done in the dark, was it?
There were some public lynchings, but most of them did take place out of sight in the woods. But there were a few instances. I mean, even though law enforcement hardly existed to support or protect the rights of blacks, even in the most racist of circumstances, it would have taken quite a bit of gall to lynch somebody on the courthouse lawn.
Oh, yeah.
There were police, there were sheriffs, and even though they may have been implicated, even members of the Klan, you couldn't have just someone just come and just lynch somebody on your lawn of the courthouse. So you had some instances in which that was done. We'll talk about Claude Neal and his lynching in 1934 in Mariana, where we'll get the details later, but he was lynched out in the country, and then his body was brought to the Jackson County Courthouse and then hung on a tree. The tree is still there in Jackson County, Mariana, where they hung Claude Neal's body. And the sheriff allowed this to happen for several hours, and then when he took the body down and took it to the front of the police station and laid Claude Neal's body there so the folks could then come by and see it. So I don't know of instances in which sheriffs have been so blatant as to allow someone to be lynched on the courthouse lawn.
In previous episodes, we talked about the history of slavery, and you went into that in a lot of detail. And my perception, I think as many, of how slaves were punished when they tried to run away or whatever. Once the white man would cut off a hand, cut off a foot, sometimes cut off an ear. And I don't remember hearing that much about slaves being lynched, maybe even shot for some reason. How did hanging or lynching become so prevalent later, but it wasn't really used with slaves, was it?
No, it wasn't. The law at the time, we're talking about up until the Civil War, if a slave killed a white person, even the master or the mistress, now you know he got to die.
All right.
If you lynched that slave, then you didn't get any money back from the state for the loss of your property. If a slave committed a murder, you had the sheriff arrest him. The slave was then tried, obviously found guilty, killed, and then you get your money from the state to reimburse you for the loss of your property. But you didn't get that if you just lynched the person yourself.
No, I'm not following. You just lost me. What does the state have to do with the ownership of a slave to the extent that if you lose a slave, the state will pay you back? Where's that money coming from? Why was the state entangled in the whole slavery business to that extent?
The state was a part of the apparatus that enabled and perpetuated slavery. Why would the state give money to a slave master whose slave the state lynched?
Right.
Because that was considered a loss of property. Same way, they don't have an insurance company like Geico to give you your money.
Stop advertising.
Allstate wouldn't come in and pay you.
Stop advertising.
No, I think the state probably, I'm guessing now, I can't be certain, but I think the logic, if you can call it that, used by the state was that in order for the system of slavery to be perpetuated and continued, that the slave owner had to have some guarantee of replacing lost property that was not his fault or her fault for losing. Therefore, the state was acting more or less like an insurance company.
Let me ask you a rather sensitive question here. Why were many of the blacks who were lynched sexually mutilated?
Blacks who were accused of sexually assaulting white women had a good chance that they'd mutilate the body. Normally that involved castration, cutting up the penis. Often the body part would be taken home by the survivors or the alleged victim, father, the husband. in many instances, the parts of the body would be put in formaldehyde or alcohol and stored and kept as a souvenir of the event. This was very, very common to take body parts from slaves. Often they would, for the ones who were not involved in alleged sexual attacks, they may still mutilate by taking fingers or toes or something of that sort as a memento. Sexual mutilations were reserved for black men and boys who were allegedly involved in some sort of sexual and inappropriate sexual contact against a white woman. And in my view, there was a deep psychological basis for this. I put it at the hands of sexual perversion and jealousy, where white men in the South in those days were afraid of black men, felt themselves to be sexually impotent or certainly not as powerful as black men were. And so there was a lot of penis envy that came from white men against black men. So that if there was any excuse, much less having been accused of attacking a white woman, they would commit these horrendous acts. It was an expression of sexual perversion and jealousy and animosity. And there were white men in Florida who were lynched, not necessarily, but lynched. Not many, but there were white men in Florida who were lynched, but there's not a single instance that I found of a white victim of lynching being sexually mutilated. It was not common for victims to be mutilated, but it was more frequently done than people recognize.
Were women lynched?
Yes. Oh, yes. Stella Young. We're going to talk about the lynchings in Newberry in just a little bit, but there were women, black women, who were lynched, and I'll tell you why, Ray. Most of the female victims of lynching were relatives of persons that they were looking for, that the mob or the police was looking for.
Okay. And they wouldn't tell?
They wouldn't tell, or they helped the person get away, or they hid the person.
Okay.
So a common response to a person who they sought to lynch was to go after the family. And this is what happened in Newberry, which we'll talk about in the next episode.
Okay, let's wrap this episode up with a couple of comments from you on the emergence of the KKK. Now, we're talking about lynching. Everybody knows the KKK. Try to put that together for us.
The Klan emerged after the Civil War. It started in Tennessee, actually, and it spread. Mostly ex-Confederate soldiers who had nothing to do, no work. And there was in the South the view that the Union, the federal troops who were in the South, would not protect white women from black men, who these white men saw as beasts that were now unleashed, and white women are going to be attacked. So there was a sense that since the government probably won't protect our women, we need to do it ourselves. Therefore, these former Confederates got together, formed their little organizations, and they were often hired or worked voluntarily for the former plantation owners, who are now the people who own the property. And these men would be hired or would volunteer to go out at night, especially, and round up blacks who were out of place. Whites were very concerned about black men in particular being where they should be at any given time. So if you left the plantation or left your farm where you were sharecropping at night and you were found wandering around the countryside going to visit somebody, these people would ride up, whip you, and then take you back where you belong. They didn't kill people. They were night riders. They were
Keep them, control them.
And bring them back. Not only in the most egregious cases where they can plan to get involved in actually killing people, but of course they did that as well. But the impetus for it was white men of the South must protect white women of the South because the Union won't do it, and the black men are dangerous to them.
Now, is there any truth to this part of our history that the reason that the KKK came up with the white robes was to frighten black people because we were supposed to think that they were ghosts or something?
It's true, yeah. There were riders riding through the woods who covered themselves up with coat, something just to ward off the weather, and they would be out in the woods riding horses covered up like that, and the blacks would see them. And they thought that they were headless horsemen riding through the woods. And the people ran. And these Klansmen saw what an impact this getup, this garb had on black people. It really scared the hell out of them. So the emergence of the Klan regalia and all of that came out of black superstition, that these people were ghosts who were riding through the woods hunting black people.
And we can frighten them.
Yeah, and it worked.
Is there any record anywhere of any black person ever being initiated as a full member of one of the Klan organizations?
Well, it depends on what you mean by black, because you had black people who were 7/8 white, who passed for white, but technically, by law, they were black. And there were black folks who were so white they could join the Klan and not be noticed as not being white.
But wouldn't that be dangerous?
Well, if they got discovered, it would be.
Right.
But I don't know of any case in which a black person was able to join the Klan as an active member.
That's really my question. I'm not quite sure what you have to swear to join the Klan. Has there ever been a documented case of a person as dark as me, and I'm by no means, my listeners can't see this, but I'm by no means.
He's black, y'all.
I cannot imagine that there's a case where someone as dark as me have been allowed, permitted, encouraged to join the Klan.
You're right. There's not.
Okay, that answers that question. Marvin, I'd like to thank you for all the information that you've shared on this topic and look forward to talking to you about locations of lynchings in Florida.
Let's do it.
Okay, so
next episode.
We will close this episode, and we invite all of our listeners to please rate, subscribe, and comment to our podcast. Thank you.
I am Dr. Marvin Dunn. I'm the author of several books dealing with black history in Florida. The first book was on the Miami Riot of 1980. Crossing the Bounds was written by myself and Bruce Porter. I've also written Black Miami in the 20th Century, and it deals with the history of lynching in Florida. And my latest book is called A History of Florida Through Black Eyes, and it traces the history of blacks in Florida from the arrival of black people with the Spanish. These books are available on Amazon.
We'd like to thank our sponsors, Aris Crown All Natural Products and Clockwork Tracks, for providing our podcast music. Special thanks also to our editor, Track 53, as well as HGAB Studios and MRD2 Media.
You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at TBE Unfiltered, or go to our website at tbeunfiltered.com.
And when you do, don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe.
See you next week.